You've been knocked down so many times that getting back up feels pointless, and every effort to move forward ends in another crushing setback. You're starting to believe that maybe you're just destined to lose, while others effortlessly claim victory after victory. I am Sun Tzu, the ancient strategist, who discovered that defeat is never permanent for those who understand the true nature of warfare. What I learned about turning defeat into inevitable victory will transform how you see every setback, showing you that your darkest moment is actually your greatest strategic opportunity. But first, like this video, subscribe for more ancient wisdom, and comment below where you're watching from. I want to know which corner of the world is ready to transform defeat into victory. Let me share with you something I have never spoken of before: the broken sword of my youth, the first weapon I shattered in training. This artifact sits before me now, its jagged edges reminding me that initial failure forges future strength. Most know me as the master strategist, but I was once dismissed as unfit for command after a series of humiliating defeats that nearly ended my military career before it began. I remember the first time I led men into battle. I was young, arrogant, and convinced that my theoretical knowledge would translate into immediate victory. The enemy routed my forces completely. I watched my soldiers flee in terror while I stood there, sword broken, covered in mud and shame. My commanding officer stripped me of rank and told me I would never amount to anything as a military leader. The second defeat came months later when I was given another chance. This time, I overcompensated for my previous failure by being overly aggressive. I charged into battle with reckless abandon, thinking that courage alone would overcome my lack of experience. Again, I was soundly defeated. Again, my men suffered for my incompetence. The whispers began. Sun Tzu is cursed, they said. He brings defeat wherever he goes. But it was during my third devastating loss that something shifted within me. As I sat among the wounded, my broken sword beside me, I realized that defeat was not my enemy, was my greatest teacher. Each loss had revealed something crucial about warfare that no amount of studying could have taught me. My first defeat taught me that knowledge without experience is worthless. My second showed me that courage without strategy is suicide. My third revealed that the enemy I needed to conquer first was my own ignorance. From that moment forward, I began to see defeat differently. Instead of something that happened to me, it became something that happened for me. Each setback became a classroom where I learned lessons that would later prove invaluable. The shame I felt transformed into strategic wisdom, and the humiliation became the foundation of my future understanding of warfare. This is why I tell you, now your defeats are not evidence of your inadequacy. They are the universe's way of preparing you for victories you cannot yet imagine. In my tent, I keep the mirror of honest reflection, a bronze mirror I carried, not just to examine my appearance, but to study my failures with brutal honesty. This mirror taught me to develop a revolutionary way of viewing defeat as temporary positioning rather than permanent failure. Most people fundamentally misunderstand what defeat represents, and this misunderstanding keeps them trapped in cycles of loss. When I look into this mirror after a defeat, I do not see a failed commander. I see a strategist gathering intelligence. You must understand that defeat is never about your worth as a person. It is about the gap between your current capabilities and the demands of your situation. This gap is not permanent unless you make it so by refusing to learn from it. I learned to separate losing a battle from losing the war. A battle is a single engagement, a moment in time where circumstances align against you. A war is the total campaign, the ultimate objective you are fighting to achieve. I have lost countless battles while winning every war that mattered. The key is understanding that battles are temporary, but the lessons they teach become permanent parts of your strategic arsenal. During my darkest period, when defeat followed defeat, I made a crucial distinction between my identity and my circumstances. My circumstances were temporary, was currently losing battles. My identity was permanent. I was a student of warfare who happened to be in an intense learning phase. This reframing allowed me to endure defeats that would have broken a lesser mind. I remember one particularly devastating loss where I lost not just the battle, but most of my army and nearly my life. As I retreated, bloodied and broken, I forced myself to analyze what had gone wrong. Instead of drowning in self-pity, I treated the defeat as the most expensive education I had ever received. I asked myself, what did this defeat teach me about enemy tactics? What did it reveal about my own weaknesses? How could I use this knowledge to ensure it never happened again? This practice of extracting wisdom from defeat became my secret weapon. While my enemies celebrated their victories and learned nothing new, I transformed every defeat into strategic intelligence. I began to see that defeat was not the opposite of victory. It was victory in disguise, waiting to be unwrapped by someone wise enough to recognize its true nature. The difference between those who rise from defeat and those who remain defeated is simple. The risers see defeat as temporary feedback, while the defeated see it as permanent judgment. The scroll of inner inventory sits beside me, my personal assessment document listing every weakness, fear, and limitation I discovered through defeat. This scroll represents the most valuable intelligence I ever gathered, and it came not from spying on enemies, but from honest examination of myself during my darkest hours. Defeat has a unique power to strip away illusions and reveal truth. When you are winning, it is easy to believe you are invincible, that your success comes from superior ability rather than favorable circumstances. But when defeat crushes those illusions, you finally see yourself as you truly are, not better or worse than you imagined, but different. This clarity is defeat's greatest gift. I recall my most humiliating loss when I was completely outmaneuvered by an enemy I had underestimated. As I fled the battlefield, my pride shattered and my confidence destroyed. I was forced to confront uncomfortable truths about myself. I discovered that I was arrogant, impatient, and prone to making assumptions about my enemies based on limited information. These revelations were painful, but they were also liberating. For the first time, I knew exactly what I needed to work on. Instead of vague aspirations to become better, I had a specific list of weaknesses to address. My arrogance needed to be replaced with humble assessment. My impatience required discipline and strategic thinking. My assumptions demanded thorough intelligence gathering. Defeat had given me a roadmap for improvement that no victory ever could. I began the practice of cataloging lessons from each setback, writing them in this scroll with meticulous detail. After every defeat, I would ask myself, what weakness did this expose? What fear did it reveal? What limitation did it highlight? I treated these discoveries not as sources of shame, but as valuable intelligence about my own capabilities and areas for development. The scroll grew thicker with each defeat, but so did my understanding of myself. I learned that I was not naturally gifted at reading battlefield terrain, so I studied geography obsessively. I discovered that I struggled with managing multiple simultaneous threats, so I developed systems for prioritizing and delegating. Each weakness revealed by defeat became a strength I deliberately cultivated. This is why I tell you that defeat is the universe's way of revealing your authentic strength. Not the strength you wish you had or the strength others see in you, but the strength that actually exists and can be developed. When defeat strips away your pretenses and shows you exactly where you stand, you finally know where to direct your efforts. Your defeats are not punishments, they are diagnostic tools. They reveal precisely what needs attention, development, and improvement. The question is not whether you will face defeat, but whether you will have the courage to learn from what it reveals about you. Before me lies the mask of false permanence, ceremonial mask representing the illusion that defeat is permanent and defining. This mask taught me to personify defeat as an opponent with specific tactics and weaknesses, rather than treating it as an abstract force beyond my understanding. Defeat is a cunning enemy that fights not with swords or armies, but with psychological warfare. Its primary weapons are shame, fear, and discouragement. It wields these weapons with masterful precision. Defeat whispers that this setback defines you, that this failure reveals your true inadequacy, that you should abandon your dreams, because you are clearly not meant to achieve them. I remember lying awake after my worst defeat, listening to that insidious voice whisper, "You're finished, Sun Tzu. You were never meant to be a great strategist. This defeat proves it." The voice was so convincing, so authoritative, that I almost believed it. But then I realized I was being manipulated by an enemy that wanted me to surrender without fighting back. Defeat's strategy is to make temporary circumstances feel permanent. It magnifies present pain while minimizing future possibility. It focuses your attention on what you have lost while blinding you to what you might gain. It convinces you that your current position is your final destination, that there is no path forward from where you now stand. But here is what I discovered through careful study of this enemy. Defeat's power comes entirely from your belief in its permanence. The moment you recognize defeat as temporary positioning rather than permanent identity, its hold over you begins to weaken. Defeat can only maintain its psychological grip as long as you accept its narrative about your future. In the modern world, defeat has become even more sophisticated in its methods. It uses social comparison to amplify your sense of failure, showing you others who appear to be succeeding while you struggle. It uses past failures as evidence of future inadequacy, building a case that you should not even attempt to recover. It whispers that recovery is for other people, people who are somehow fundamentally different from you. Understanding defeat's true nature allows you to fight back strategically. When defeat tells you this setback is permanent, you can respond with evidence of others who have recovered from similar or worse circumstances. When it whispers that you are not capable of success, you can catalogue your past victories and improvements. When it suggests you should quit, you can remind yourself that you are in a temporary position, not a permanent identity. The key insight is this: defeat is not an objective reality. It is a story being told about your current circumstances. And like any story, it can be rewritten. Defeat wants you to believe you are the victim in a tragedy, but you have the power to recast yourself as the hero in a comeback story that has not yet reached its climax. The map of fallen territories lies spread before me, a strategic map, marking every area of life where I experienced significant defeats. This map taught me that analyzing the landscape where defeat occurs is as crucial as understanding defeat itself. Different terrains require different strategies, and attempting to fight all battles simultaneously leads to total exhaustion. In my personal assessment, I identified my financial defeats, the investments that failed, the opportunities I missed, the resources I squandered through poor judgment. I mapped my relationship defeats, the friendships that ended in betrayal, the romantic partnerships that crumbled under pressure, the family connections strained by my ambitions. I charted my career defeats, the promotions denied, the projects that failed, the reputation damaged by public failures. Each area of defeat had its own characteristics and demanded its own approach. My financial defeats often stemmed from impatience and inadequate research. My relationship defeats usually involved pride and poor communication. My career defeats frequently resulted from overconfidence and insufficient preparation. Recognizing these patterns allowed me to develop targeted strategies rather than applying generic solutions to specific problems. The crucial insight I gained was that not all defeats deserve equal attention or immediate response. Some defeats were strategic retreat areas, where I chose to accept temporary loss to preserve resources for more important battles. Other defeats were learning laboratory failures I embraced specifically to gain knowledge I could not acquire any other way. Still others were necessary sacrifices, losses I accepted to achieve larger victories. I learned to categorize my defeats into 3 types: defeats to ignore, defeats to learn from, and defeats to reverse. The defeats to ignore were usually minor setbacks in areas that did not significantly impact my primary objectives. The defeats to learn from were failures that revealed important information about my capabilities or circumstances. The defeats to reverse were losses in areas crucial to my core mission that required immediate, strategic response. This categorization prevented me from becoming overwhelmed by the sheer number of areas where I was not succeeding. Instead of trying to recover from every defeat simultaneously, which would have scattered my focus and depleted my resources, could concentrate my efforts where they would have the greatest impact. The map also revealed something crucial about timing. Some territories needed to be reclaimed immediately to prevent further losses. Others could be left in enemy hands temporarily while I built strength elsewhere. Still, others were better abandoned entirely so I could focus on more promising terrain. Understanding the landscape of your defeated life allows you to fight smarter, not harder. You begin to see that strategic defeat in unimportant areas can actually strengthen your position in areas that matter. Not every lost battle needs to be refought, and not every defeat needs to be reversed immediately. The hourglass of patient strategy sits upon my desk, an ancient timepiece that taught me victory belongs to those who understand timing. This hourglass reminds me of a defeat that seemed catastrophic at the time, but later proved to be perfectly timed preparation for my greatest triumph. The sand falls at its own pace, and attempts to speed the process only result in chaos. I was once offered command of the most prestigious military campaign of my generation, a chance to lead the emperor's personal army against a rebellion that threatened the stability of the entire kingdom. This appointment would have elevated my status beyond anything I had previously achieved, and established my reputation as the empire's premier military strategist. When my political enemies succeeded in having me removed from consideration at the last moment, I was devastated beyond description. I felt humiliated by the public nature of my rejection. Colleagues who had once sought my counsel now avoided me, uncertain whether association with my disgrace might damage their own prospects. The appointment went to a commander I considered far less capable, someone whose primary qualification seemed to be his family's political connections rather than his military competence. For months, I wallowed in bitterness and self-pity. I watched from afar as my replacement organized the campaign, made preparations I considered inadequate, and ignored strategic principles I thought fundamental to success. Everything in me wanted to warn the emperor about the disaster I saw approaching, but my position allowed no such communication. I had been dismissed, my counsel was no longer welcome, and my warnings would likely be seen as sour grapes from a rejected candidate. What seemed like devastating rejection had actually been perfectly timed protection. The defeat I thought would end my ambitions had positioned me for success. I never could have achieved otherwise. This experience taught me to distinguish between temporary setbacks and final outcomes. A setback is simply a delay, a redirection, or a repositioning. An outcome is the final result after all moves have been made. Most people mistake temporary setbacks for final outcomes and give up just before their breakthrough arrives. I learned that rushing to recover from defeat often leads to greater defeat because it forces you to act from weakness rather than strength. When you are desperate to reverse a defeat quickly, you make compromised decisions, accept unfavorable terms, and create new problems, while trying to solve old ones. The strategic value of apparent defeat lies in the opportunities it creates while others believe you are finished. When enemies think you are defeated, they lower their guard. When competitors believe you are out of the game, they stop monitoring your activities. When observers assume you are done, they stop paying attention to your preparations. I developed what I call the patience of the strategist, the ability to let defeats ripen into advantages rather than attempting immediate reversal. This patience requires tremendous discipline because everything in you wants to fight back immediately. To prove the defeat was temporary, the hourglass teaches that timing is everything in the transformation from defeat to victory. Your recovery will happen when you are truly ready, not when you are merely desperate for it to happen. I did not realize was that this apparent defeat had saved me from a disaster that would have ended my career permanently and possibly cost me my life. The campaign I had desperately wanted to lead was doomed from the beginning, not because of military factors I could have controlled, but because of political dynamics I had not even considered. The rebellion we were meant to suppress had been secretly supported by powerful factions within the imperial court, who wanted to weaken the emperor's position. The campaign was designed to fail, and whoever led it was intended to serve as a scapegoat for a larger political strategy I had been too naive to recognize. My rejection had been orchestrated not by enemies who wanted to harm my career, but by allies who wanted to protect me from destruction I was walking toward blindly. The commander who received my position led the campaign to spectacular failure, exactly as I had predicted, but for reasons I had never imagined. His reputation was destroyed, his career ended, and his name became synonymous with military incompetence. Several of his key subordinates were executed for treason, charged with deliberately sabotaging the campaign. The political faction that had supported his appointment was purged from the court, their leaders exiled or imprisoned. Meanwhile, my forced absence from this campaign allowed me to study its progress from the outside, learning invaluable lessons about what not to do without paying the price of personal failure. I watched how political considerations could undermine military strategy, how court intrigue could determine battlefield outcomes, and how the most competent commanders could be destroyed by forces completely beyond their control. When the next campaign opportunity arose 6 months later, I was ready with knowledge gained from observing another's defeat, while my competitor had been eliminated entirely. The political landscape had been cleansed of the factions that would have undermined my efforts. The emperor, chastened by his previous poor judgment, was now focused on military competence rather than political convenience. The banner of tactical withdrawal hangs in my study, a flag I raised during my most strategic retreat, which led to my greatest victory. This banner represents one of the most difficult lessons I learned. Sometimes the best response to defeat is to amplify it temporarily, appearing even weaker than you are, while secretly gathering strength for an overwhelming comeback. I recall a campaign where I was vastly outnumbered and facing certain destruction. My army was exhausted, supplies were running low, and enemy forces surrounded us on 3 sides. Every tactical manual would have demanded I make a heroic stand, fighting to the last man to preserve honor and reputation. Instead, I chose what appeared to be cowardly flight. I retreated so rapidly and completely that my enemies believed I had been thoroughly routed. This decision was agony for everyone involved. My officers questioned my courage openly, wondering if their commander had lost his nerve at the crucial moment. My soldiers felt abandoned and confused, unable to understand why we were fleeing when we still had the capability to fight. My enemies celebrated what they believed was my humiliating defeat, spreading word throughout the region that Sun Tzu had finally been broken. But while they celebrated, I was implementing a strategy that would ultimately destroy them all. I retreated to terrain I knew better than they did, using familiar paths that allowed rapid movement while forcing them to navigate unknown territory. I used their pursuit to stretch their supply lines beyond sustainability, knowing they would have to choose between maintaining their chase and maintaining their cohesion. I allowed them to grow overconfident in their apparent victory, watching as their discipline relaxed and their formation became careless. They began to see my continued retreat as proof of their superiority rather than evidence of my strategy. This overconfidence made them careless about their own vulnerabilities. When I finally struck back 3 weeks later, they were scattered across unfamiliar territory, exhausted from pursuit, and completely unprepared for the devastating counterattack that destroyed their entire force. The retreat that had seemed like cowardice became the setup for the most complete victory of my career. The difference between cowardly flight and strategic repositioning lies in intention and preparation. Flight is reactive, driven by fear and desperation. Strategic retreat is proactive, driven by long-term planning and resource preservation. Flight preserves the individual moment at the cost of future opportunities. Strategic retreat sacrifices the immediate moment to create future advantages. Learning to retreat strategically required me to overcome my ego's need for immediate vindication. When others mocked my retreat, everything in me wanted to turn and fight to prove them wrong. But I had learned that proving others wrong in the moment often prevents you from proving them wrong in ways that matter. The courage required for strategic retreat is actually greater than the courage required for a heroic last stand. Standing and fighting feels noble and draws admiration. Retreating feels shameful and invites contempt. But the strategist must be willing to endure temporary shame to achieve permanent victory. I developed specific criteria for when retreat serves strategy better than resistance. When the cost of continued fighting exceeds the value of the position being defended. Retreat preserves resources for more important battles. When enemies expect resistance and have prepared for it, retreat forces them to adapt to unexpected circumstances. Strategic retreat also serves the crucial function of resource preservation. Every defeat costs something: energy, money, reputation, relationships, time. Losing battles depletes these resources without generating value. Strategic retreat preserves your resources while your enemies expend theirs, pursuing you. The banner reminds me that apparent defeat can be the foundation of actual victory when managed strategically. Your enemy's celebration of your retreat often becomes the overconfidence that enables your comeback. The ledger of lessons learned lies open before me, my personal journal documenting every insight gained from each defeat I experienced. This ledger represents my most valuable possession, worth more than gold or weapons, because it contains the strategic intelligence that transformed me from a defeated commander into an unbeatable strategist. Every defeat contains multiple layers of information about your path forward, but most people are too emotional to extract this intelligence. While the pain is fresh, they focus on the humiliation, the loss, the damage to their reputation, and miss the invaluable data that defeat provides about their capabilities, their enemies, and their circumstances. I learned to treat defeat like a master spy treats captured enemy documents as a source of crucial intelligence that must be analyzed methodically and completely. After each defeat, I would force myself to examine what had gone wrong from every possible angle. No matter how painful the analysis became, one particularly devastating defeat taught me that I had been relying on outdated intelligence about enemy capabilities. I had assumed my opponents were using the same tactics that had failed against me previously, but they had evolved their approach while I remained static. This defeat revealed that I needed to continuously update my understanding of the competitive landscape rather than assuming past patterns would continue. The lesson was profound. Success can blind you to change. When something works, you naturally want to keep doing it the same way. But enemies adapt, circumstances shift, and what succeeded yesterday may fail tomorrow. My defeat forced me to develop systems for continuous intelligence gathering rather than relying on assumptions based on past experience. Another defeat showed me that I had been fighting the wrong battle entirely. I had focused all my energy on a visible conflict, while my real enemies were undermining me through invisible channels I had not considered. This failure taught me to always ask, what is the real battle here? What am I not seeing? Who benefits if I remain focused on the obvious problem? I discovered that I had been so concerned with direct military confrontation that I had ignored the political maneuvering that actually determined outcomes. While I prepared for battlefield victory, my enemies were securing victory through court intrigue, economic pressure, and alliance building. My defeat taught me that the most important battles are often fought away from the obvious battlefield. The practice of extracting maximum learning from minimum loss became my secret advantage. While my competitors saw defeat as something to forget quickly and move past, I saw it as expensive education that should be studied until every lesson was extracted. I would analyze not just what went wrong, but why I had made the decisions that led to failure. I developed a systematic approach to defeat analysis that served me throughout my career. First, I would document the facts without emotional interpretation, exactly what happened, when it happened, who was involved, and what the immediate consequences were. This factual foundation prevented me from creating false narratives that would lead to wrong conclusions. Then I would analyze my decision-making process leading up to the defeat. What information did I have? What assumptions did I make? What alternatives did I consider? What pressures influenced my choices? This analysis revealed patterns in my thinking that needed to be corrected. Finally, I would extract actionable insights, what I needed to learn, what I needed to change, what I needed to avoid in future situations. These insights became the foundation for new strategies and improved approaches. This grateful analysis of defeat accelerated my development far beyond what success alone could have achieved. Success teaches you that your current approach works under current conditions. Defeat teaches you how to adapt when conditions change, how to overcome unexpected challenges, and how to succeed despite unfavorable circumstances. The ledger grew thicker with each defeat, but my capabilities grew even faster. I began to see that the most successful strategists were not those who avoided defeat, but those who extracted the most value from the defeats they inevitably encountered. The hidden forge of character sits concealed in my private chambers or workshop, where I rebuilt my capabilities away from public scrutiny after my most devastating defeat. This forge represents the crucial understanding that visible defeat often provides the perfect cover for invisible growth. After my worst military disaster, when my reputation was destroyed and my enemies believed I was finished, I made a decision that saved my career. I would use their dismissal of me as camouflage for the most intensive period of development in my life, while they celebrated my downfall and turned their attention to other threats. I would transform myself in secret. The forge became my sanctuary of reconstruction. Here, away from observers and critics, I could acknowledge my weaknesses without shame and address them without interference. I studied the tactics that had defeated me until I understood them better than those who had used them against me. I analyzed my failures until I could predict exactly where my old approaches would fail. This period of secret rebuilding was the most important phase of my development, precisely because it occurred while everyone believed I was finished. There were no expectations to manage, no reputation to protect, no observers to impress. I could focus entirely on becoming better rather than appearing better. I developed new skills that my previous successes had made unnecessary. When I was winning, I had relied on natural talent and favorable circumstances. Defeat stripped away both advantages and forced me to develop actual competence. I learned to read terrain more accurately, to gather intelligence more systematically, to plan more thoroughly, and to adapt more quickly when plans failed. The strategic advantage of being underestimated cannot be overstated. When enemies believe you are weak, they prepare for a weak opponent. When competitors think you are finished, they stop monitoring your activities. When observers assume you are irrelevant, they ignore your preparations entirely. I learnt to make my rebuilding period as productive as possible by focusing on fundamentals rather than advanced techniques. Defeat had revealed that my foundational skills were weaker than I had assumed. Instead of trying to learn new complex strategies, I mastered basic competencies until they became automatic. I practiced basic sword work until my movements were perfect, studied elementary tactical maneuvers until I could execute them flawlessly under pressure, and drilled fundamental leadership principles until they became instinctive responses rather than conscious decisions. This foundation made all subsequent learning faster and more reliable. The forge also taught me that rebuilding must be comprehensive, not just focused on the specific area where defeat occurred. My military defeat had revealed weaknesses in my character, my relationships, my knowledge, and my physical capabilities. I used this period to address all these areas simultaneously. I worked on my physical conditioning, recognizing that leadership requires stamina that I had previously taken for granted. I studied philosophy and literature, understanding that strategic thinking requires broader knowledge than purely military training provides. I practiced emotional discipline, learning to manage my reactions under stress. During this time, I developed what I now call invisible strength capabilities that others cannot see, but that provide tremendous advantages when revealed at the right moment. While my enemies grew complacent and my former allies moved on to other alliances, I was becoming far more formidable than I had ever been during my visible successes. The hidden nature of this development was crucial to its effectiveness. If my rebuilding had been visible, enemies would have taken steps to interfere with it. If my progress had been obvious, competitors would have adjusted their strategies to account for my improving capabilities. If my growth had been public, observers would have formed expectations that might have pressured me to act before I was truly ready. The forge represents the truth that your greatest growth often occurs during your most difficult periods, when external pressures force internal development that comfort never could. The key is to use the privacy that defeat provides to build strength that your next opportunity will reveal. The scale of strategic priorities rests on my destined ancient balance. I used to weigh which battles deserved my limited post-defeat resources. This scale taught me that defeat forces you to become more selective about where you invest your energy, and this selectivity often makes you more powerful than you were before the defeat occurred. When you are riding high on success, you can afford to fight multiple battles simultaneously. Resources seem unlimited, confidence is high, and every conflict feels winnable. But defeat changes everything. Suddenly, every decision matters because you cannot afford another loss. This constraint, painful as it is, forces a level of strategic thinking that success rarely demands. After my great defeat, I had to rebuild with a fraction of my former resources. I could not fight every battle that presented itself. I could not respond to every provocation. I could not pursue every opportunity that seemed attractive. The scale forced me to ask crucial questions about each potential engagement. What will victory in this battle actually accomplish? What will defeat cost me? Can I afford either outcome given my current position? I learned to categorize potential battles into 3 types: battles I must win, battles I should avoid, and battles I could win but did not need to fight. The battles I must win were those directly related to my core mission conflicts, where defeat would set back my fundamental objectives significantly. These battles deserved my full attention and best resources. The battles I should avoid were those where victory would cost more than it was worth, or where defeat would damage me disproportionately to any potential gain. These included conflicts with enemies who were stronger than necessary to engage, fights over territory that was not essential to my goals, and disputes that would drain energy without advancing my position. The battles I could win but did not need to fight were the most dangerous because they tempted me to waste resources on irrelevant victories. These were conflicts where I had clear advantages and could likely succeed, but where success would not contribute meaningfully to my larger objectives. One of the most difficult lessons was learning to let some defeats remain defeats permanently. My pride demanded that I settle every score, correct every injustice, and prove every critic wrong. But the scale showed me that trying to reverse every defeat often prevents you from achieving victories that actually matter. I remember a colleague who had publicly humiliated me during my downfall, spreading rumors about my competence and character. Throughout the military hierarchy, everything in me wanted to destroy his reputation in retaliation, to prove that his criticisms were unfair and his character was worse than mine. But when I placed this battle on the scale, I realized that victory would consume enormous energy while contributing nothing to my actual goals. Defeating him would not restore my military position, improve my capabilities, or advance my career. It would only satisfy my wounded pride while depleting resources I needed for more important objectives. Instead, I let his attacks stand and focused my efforts on achievements that would make his criticism irrelevant. Years later, his career stagnated while mine flourished. My restraint had allowed me to build something substantial while he remained focused on petty conflicts. The defeat I chose not to reverse became evidence of my strategic wisdom rather than my weakness. The scale also taught me about resource allocation in recovery. When you are rebuilding from defeat, every resource is precious: time, energy, money, relationships, reputation. Spreading these resources across too many battles dilutes their impact and often results in multiple minor defeats rather than one significant victory. Strategic resource allocation means concentrating your limited capabilities on the battles that offer the greatest return on investment. This often means accepting defeats in areas that do not significantly impact your primary objectives, while focusing overwhelming force on the conflicts that can transform your entire position. The wisdom of selective engagement becomes your secret weapon as you recover from defeat, while others exhaust themselves fighting every battle that comes their way. You husband your strength for the conflicts that truly matter. The cloak of assumed weakness hangs in my wardrobe, a humble garment I wore to let enemies underestimate my recovering strength. This cloak taught me one of warfare's most sophisticated strategies: how to use others' perception of your defeat as camouflage while you rebuild your capabilities in secret. After my public downfall, I discovered that everyone's assumption of my weakness had become my greatest strategic asset. Former rivals stopped monitoring my activities because they believed I was no longer a threat. Competitors shared information freely in my presence because they assumed I was irrelevant to their plans. Allies revealed their true loyalties because they thought supporting me carried no future benefits. I learned to cultivate this perception deliberately when attending gatherings where my former status would have demanded a prominent role. I chose seats in the back and spoke only when asked direct questions. When opportunities arose to demonstrate my recovering capabilities, I sometimes declined to maintain the illusion of continued weakness. This restraint was excruciating for my ego, but invaluable for my strategy. The cloak allowed me to observe my enemies' strategies without them modifying their behavior for my benefit. I watched them reveal their plans, expose their weaknesses, and make commitments they would never have made if they believed I was still formidable. This intelligence became the foundation for comeback strategies they never saw coming. I remember one particularly valuable intelligence-gathering opportunity when a former rival, believing I was finished, invited me to a private dinner where he outlined his plans to dominate the region I had once controlled. He assumed my presence was irrelevant, perhaps even pitied my fallen state, and spoke freely about his strategies, resources, and timeline. Instead of challenging his assumptions or defending my reputation, I played the role of the defeated commander, seeking guidance from a successful peer. I asked questions that encouraged him to reveal more details, expressed admiration for his strategic thinking, and generally reinforced his belief in my arrest. He left that dinner convinced of his own superiority and my permanent insignificance. When I eventually moved against him 6 months later, every aspect of my strategy was informed by intelligence he had voluntarily provided. His surprise at my capabilities was matched only by his shock at how precisely I had anticipated and countered his every move. The defeat he thought he had witnessed became the deception that enabled his own destruction. Broadcasting your recovery often invites premature challenges from those who want to test your renewed strength or prevent your return to power. By keeping your rebuilding process invisible, you avoid conflicts that might interrupt your development while gathering intelligence about potential obstacles you will face when you do reveal your capabilities. The strategic advantage of lowered expectations cannot be overstated. When people expect little from you, modest improvements seem impressive. When they assume you are weak, normal strength appears formidable. When they believe you are finished, any sign of vitality suggests remarkable resilience. I learned to use defeat's reputation to gain time and positioning that would be impossible for someone perceived as strong. People grant concessions to the defeated that they would never offer to the powerful. They provide assistance to the fallen that they would see as unnecessary for the successful. They share opportunities with the irrelevant that they would guard jealously from competitors. The cloak taught me that perception often matters more than reality in the initial stages of recovery. Reality determines your actual capabilities, but perception determines how others respond to those capabilities. Managing perception while building reality gives you enormous advantages that focusing purely on capability development cannot provide. This strategy requires tremendous discipline because everything in your nature rebels against appearing weak when you are growing stronger. But the temporary sacrifice of ego gratification enables strategic advantages that immediate vindication would destroy. The chain of mutual understanding sits upon my table links forged with allies who only appeared when I was at my lowest point. This chain represents one of defeat's most unexpected gifts, the revelation of who your true allies actually are, and the formation of bonds with others who understand struggle from personal experience. When I was at the height of my success, I was surrounded by people who claimed friendship and loyalty. They praised my wisdom, sought my favor, and assured me of their eternal support. My chambers were always full of visitors. My opinions were constantly solicited, and my company was eagerly sought at every important gathering. I believed these relationships were based on genuine affection and mutual respect. But when defeat stripped away my power and status, most of these relationships evaporated like morning mist. The fair-weather friends disappeared without explanation. The opportunistic allies found new patrons to court, and the flatterers moved on to more promising targets. Invitations stopped coming, advice was no longer requested, and former companions suddenly became too busy to see me. This abandonment was initially devastating. I felt betrayed by people I had trusted, hurt by the superficiality of relationships I had valued, and confused by the sudden shift in how I was treated. But as the pain subsided, I began to see this exodus as valuable information rather than personal rejection. Yet in this apparent abandonment, I discovered something precious. The handful of people who remained were genuinely loyal, not to my position or power, but to me as a person. These relationships, tested by adversity and proven authentic, became the foundation of everything I built afterward. They were worth more than all the superficial connections I had lost. A junior officer who had served under me continued to visit regularly, bringing news from the military and offering his assistance, despite the fact that association with me could damage his own career prospects. An old friend from my youth maintained our friendship unchanged, treating me with the same respect and affection he had always shown. A former mentor, now retired, invited me to his home for regular meals and counsel, but defeat also introduced me to unexpected allies, people who recognized something in my struggle that resonated with their own experiences. A minor official who had been passed over for promotion offered crucial assistance because he understood what it felt like to be underestimated and overlooked. A former enemy who had experienced his own downfall provided valuable counsel because he knew the path I was walking. A merchant who had lost his business to political intrigue shared practical advice about rebuilding from nothing. A scholar who had been exiled from court for expressing unpopular opinions offered philosophical perspectives on enduring disgrace with dignity. These men became trusted advisors and eventual collaborators in my recovery. These bonds, formed through shared struggle, possessed a strength that prosperity-based relationships could never match. When people have seen you at your worst and chosen to remain, when they have risked their own reputation to support you during your disgrace, when they have invested in your recovery with no guarantee of return, these become unbreakable alliances. I learned that defeat creates the most authentic networking opportunities of your life. In prosperity, relationships often carry hidden agendas and unspoken calculations. People support you because of what you can do for them, not because of who you are. In defeat, motives become clear quickly. People who approach you when you have nothing to offer them are revealing their true character. The chain also taught me about the bonds formed with others currently experiencing their own defeats. There is an immediate understanding between those who are struggling that requires no explanation or justification. You recognize each other's pain, respect each other's fight, and offer support that comes from genuine empathy rather than social obligation. These alliances often prove more valuable than those formed during good times because they are based on mutual vulnerability rather than mutual advantage. When both parties know what it feels like to need help, they are more likely to provide it generously when their situations improve. I began to see defeat as a sorting mechanism that separates authentic relationships from transactional ones. The people who stand with you during your darkest hours reveal themselves as worthy of your trust when brighter days return. Meanwhile, those who abandon you during difficulty show you exactly how much their previous support was worth. One of the most valuable alliances I formed during my defeat was with a group of other fallen commanders who met regularly to share experiences and strategies. We called ourselves the Brotherhood of the Broken Sword, meeting in secret to avoid the stigma that open association might bring to any member whose fortunes began to improve. In these gatherings, I learned that my experience was not unique. Each member had faced similar betrayals, endured comparable humiliations, and struggled with the same questions about their worth and future. But collectively, we possessed an enormous reservoir of knowledge, connections, and capabilities that none of us could access individually. We shared intelligence about political developments, warned each other about potential opportunities and threats, and provided practical assistance when members faced specific challenges. More importantly, we reminded each other that defeat was temporary and that our current circumstances did not define our permanent value. When my recovery began, several Brotherhood members provided crucial support that made my comeback possible. They vouched for my character when others questioned my reliability, shared resources when I lacked necessary funding, and offered strategic counsel when I faced decisions beyond my experience. As my fortunes improved, I made sure to extend similar support to other members who were still struggling. This created a cycle of mutual assistance that strengthened all of us over time. The alliance that began in shared defeat became a network of mutual success that lasted for decades. Building networks of mutual support through shared struggle creates a different kind of power base, one built on loyalty and understanding, rather than fear and obligation. These relationships survive changes in fortune because they were forged in adversity and proven through hardship. They become the foundation upon which lasting success is built, because they are based on genuine character, rather than temporary advantage. The arrow of decisive action rests in my study, a special arrow I kept to remind me that recovery requires swift, precise movement once the moment for action arrives. This arrow taught me the crucial difference between patient waiting and decisive action, and why momentum in recovery must be protected at all costs. There comes a moment in every recovery when preparation must transition to action. This moment is often subtle and easy to miss, but recognizing it correctly determines whether your comeback succeeds or stagnates indefinitely. I learned to identify this transition by watching for specific indicators that the time for rebuilding had ended and the time for advancing had begun. The first indicator was when my capabilities exceeded the minimum requirements for success in my chosen objective. I had spent months developing new skills, correcting old weaknesses, and building resources. When my assessment showed that I possessed everything necessary to succeed, continued preparation became procrastination rather than prudence. The second indicator was when opposition was distracted or weakened. My enemies had grown complacent during my absence, assuming I was permanently neutralized. Their attention had shifted to other threats, their defenses had relaxed, and their unity had begun to fracture. These conditions would not last indefinitely, making timing crucial. The third indicator was when circumstances aligned favorably for my particular strengths and objectives. Political winds had shifted, economic conditions had changed, and social dynamics had evolved in ways that favored my approach over my competitors. These alignments were temporary and needed to be exploited while they existed. I remember the precise moment when I knew my recovery period was complete. I had been rebuilding in secret for 8 months, developing new strategies and strengthening old capabilities. My enemies had grown complacent, my former position had weakened due to poor leadership, and an opportunity arose that perfectly matched my restored abilities. Everything in my analytical mind wanted to prepare more, plan longer, eliminate more risks. I could see ways to improve my position further, additional skills that might prove useful, and potential complications that more preparation might prevent. But the arrow reminded me that excessive preparation often becomes an excuse for avoiding action. The transition from recovery to comeback requires a complete shift in mindset. During the rebuilding phase, caution and patience are virtues. You analyze carefully, move slowly, and avoid unnecessary risks, because premature action could destroy everything you have worked to build. But when the moment for action arrives, these same qualities become liabilities. Speed becomes more valuable than perfection, because windows of opportunity close quickly. Momentum becomes more important than comfort, because hesitation allows opposition to adapt and respond. Decisive action becomes more critical than complete certainty, because waiting for perfect conditions often means waiting forever. I learned that momentum in recovery has unique characteristics that must be understood and protected. Unlike the momentum of success, which can be sustained over long periods through consistent performance, comeback momentum is fragile and time-limited. It depends on factors beyond your control: your opponent's complacency, external circumstances, other people's attention and resources. When these factors align favorably, you must act quickly before they shift again. The enemy's distraction that creates your opening may be temporary. The favorable circumstances that enable your strategy may change. The resources you need for success may become unavailable if you delay too long. The difference between patient waiting and decisive action lies in recognizing when conditions have shifted from requiring preparation to demanding execution. Patient waiting serves you when action would be premature or when you lack necessary capabilities. Decisive action serves you when delay will cost opportunities or when your preparation has reached the point of diminishing returns. Protecting momentum once it begins requires ruthless prioritization. Every decision must be evaluated based on whether it accelerates or slows your progress. Distractions that seemed manageable during the rebuilding phase become dangerous momentum killers during active recovery. I developed what I call the discipline of the decisive moment, the ability to shift from careful preparation to bold action when circumstances demand it. This requires overcoming the natural tendency to seek more certainty, more preparation, more favorable conditions. The most dangerous moment in any recovery is when you have prepared enough to succeed, but not enough to feel completely confident. This is when many people falter, choosing to prepare indefinitely rather than risk failure after investing so much in their comeback. But this is precisely when action becomes most crucial. I learned to recognize the symptoms of over-preparation when additional planning began yielding diminishing returns. When I found myself researching information I already knew. When I started creating contingencies for increasingly unlikely scenarios. These were signs that preparation had become procrastination. During my own recovery, I reached a point where I knew I was ready, but felt I could become more ready. I had rebuilt my capabilities, identified my opportunity, and developed my strategy. But doubt whispered that I should wait another month, gather more intelligence, prepare for additional contingencies. The arrow reminded me that perfect preparation is the enemy of timely action. My enemies would not remain complacent indefinitely. The favorable circumstances would not last forever. The opportunity that seemed so clear today might vanish tomorrow if I failed to seize it while it existed. When I finally acted, my preparation proved more than adequate. The additional month of planning I had considered would have added little value while potentially costing me the entire opportunity. The momentum I generated by acting when ready, rather than when perfect, became the foundation of my most significant victory. Recovery momentum must be protected like a precious flame that can be easily extinguished by careless handling. Every decision during the action phase must be evaluated through the lens of acceleration versus deceleration. Activities that seemed valuable during preparation become dangerous. Distractions during execution. The arrow teaches that deployment timing matters more than deployment perfection. A good strategy executed at the right moment often succeeds better than a perfect strategy executed too late. The window of opportunity cares nothing about your desire for additional preparation. The arrow reminds me that recovery is not just about rebuilding capabilities, it is about deploying those capabilities at the moment when deployment will have maximum impact. All the preparation in the world becomes worthless if you miss the window when action would succeed most completely. The compass of uncharted routes sits before me, a navigation tool that always pointed toward paths others couldn't see. This compass guided me to the realization that my greatest victories came through routes opened by previous defeats, paths that would never have been available if I had succeeded along conventional lines. When my traditional military career was destroyed by public defeat, I was forced to consider approaches I had previously dismissed as beneath my status or unworthy of my talents. The compass pointed me toward studying with teachers I had once considered inferior, learning from traditions I had dismissed as outdated, and developing capabilities I had never thought necessary for a commander of my supposed caliber. This humbling exploration led me to insights that conventional success would never have provided. I learned psychological warfare from a discredited philosopher who understood how fear and hope could be weaponized more effectively than swords or spears. I studied terrain analysis from a failed merchant who had traveled extensively and understood geography from a commercial perspective that military maps never captured. I learned supply chain management from a former quartermaster who had been dismissed for losing a single battle but understood logistics better than anyone in the regular army. I studied leadership psychology from a retired administrator who had managed civilian populations during times of crisis and knew how to maintain loyalty when resources were scarce. Each of these teachers had knowledge that traditional military academies did not provide, knowledge that became crucial to my eventual success. More importantly, their willingness to teach me was directly related to my fallen status. They would never have shared their expertise with a successful general who might dismiss their contributions, but they were eager to help a defeated commander who truly appreciated their wisdom. The compass taught me that defeat forces you to discover your most authentic strengths by stripping away the paths that depended on artificial advantages. When I was successful through conventional means, I relied heavily on my family connections, my formal education, my assigned resources, and my institutional position. When defeat eliminated these supports, I had to discover what capabilities I actually possessed, independent of external factors. I found that I had an unusual ability to see patterns in seemingly random events, connecting developments that others viewed as unrelated into coherent strategic pictures. I discovered a talent for inspiring loyalty in people others had written off as unimportant or unreliable. I realized that my strategic mind worked best when conventional approaches were impossible and creative solutions were required. These strengths had been overshadowed by my reliance on traditional advantages, but defeat revealed them as my true competitive advantages. They were capabilities that belonged to me personally rather than to my position, skills that could not be stripped away by political maneuvering or institutional changes. My greatest victory came through a route that was only available because of my previous defeat. My enemies expected me to attempt to come back through traditional military channels, so they had prepared extensive defenses against conventional strategies. They monitored regular army recruitment, watched for signs of political support, and guarded against typical approaches to regaining military position. Instead, I approached through economic alliances they had not anticipated, using merchant networks to move resources and information. I employed psychological tactics learned from my unconventional teachers, creating fear and uncertainty among my enemies' supporters. I utilized political connections formed during my exile, relationships with people who had been marginalized by the same forces that had defeated me. The victory was so complete and so unexpected that it established my reputation more firmly than any conventional triumph could have achieved. People remembered not just that I had won, but that I had found a way to win that no one else had imagined possible. This gave me a mystique that conventional success never provides. The compass points toward unfamiliar territory because familiar routes rarely lead to different destinations. This requires tremendous courage because unfamiliar paths offer no guarantee of success and no clear examples to follow. You must proceed based on logic and intuition rather than proven models. But this uncertainty becomes your advantage. When you succeed through an unexpected route, competitors cannot easily replicate your success because they cannot understand your methodology. When you win through unfamiliar means, enemies cannot prepare effective defenses because they cannot predict your approach. The compass also taught me that defeat often reveals paths that success would never expose. When conventional routes are blocked, you are forced to explore alternatives that might prove superior to the original plan. What seems like a detour often becomes a shortcut to destinations you never knew existed. I discovered that my unconventional education during defeat had given me capabilities that traditional training could not provide. My studies with dismissed teachers, my experiences with failed systems, and my exposure to alternative approaches had created a unique combination of knowledge that no academy could replicate. When I finally returned to prominence, I brought perspectives that no one else possessed. I understood psychological warfare because I had been its target. I knew economic strategy because I had experienced financial pressure. I comprehended political maneuvering because I had been its victim. These insights, born from defeat, became the foundation of strategies that conventional training would never have suggested. The compass points toward a crucial truth. Your greatest strengths often emerge from your deepest defeats. The very experiences that seem to disqualify you from success may actually qualify you for success that others cannot achieve. The skills you develop while struggling may prove more valuable than the abilities you possessed while succeeding. I learned to trust the compass even when it pointed toward territory that seemed impossible to navigate. Every unconventional path I followed led to discoveries that enhanced my capabilities and opened new possibilities. The routes that appeared most difficult often proved most rewarding, precisely because few others were willing to explore them. The compass reminds me that conventional wisdom is conventional precisely because it represents the thinking of the majority. When you follow conventional paths, you compete with everyone else who is following the same routes. When you trust the compass to guide you through uncharted territory, you often find yourself alone on paths that lead to uncontested victories. Your defeats have prepared you for a victory route that others cannot see and will not expect. The compass of your experience points toward opportunities that only you can recognize and achievements that only you can accomplish. Trust its guidance, even when the path seems uncertain, because uncertainty is often the price of uniqueness. The crown of inner sovereignty rests invisible upon my head, representing unshakable inner authority regardless of external circumstances. This crown taught me the most crucial lesson of my entire career: how to maintain mental victory even during apparent defeat, separating temporary circumstances from permanent identity. The crown became my secret weapon during the darkest period of my life. While enemies celebrated my downfall and former allies distanced themselves from my disgrace, I wore this invisible crown as a reminder that my worth was not determined by my current circumstances. I was not a defeated person experiencing temporary success. I was a victorious person experiencing temporary defeat. This distinction changed everything about how I processed setbacks. Instead of seeing each day of continued defeat as evidence of my inadequacy, I saw it as another day of gathering intelligence, building strength, and positioning for eventual victory. The crown reminded me that external defeat could only become internal defeat if I allowed it, and I refused to grant that permission. I developed specific practices for preserving confidence during extended losses. Each morning, I would remind myself of past victories, not to dwell in nostalgia, but to maintain connection with my proven capabilities. I would visualize my eventual comeback in detail, not as fantasy, but as inevitable reality that was simply taking longer to manifest than I had initially expected. The practice of separating temporary circumstances from permanent identity required constant vigilance. Everything in my environment reinforced the narrative of permanent defeat: the way people looked at me, the opportunities I was no longer offered, the respect I no longer commanded. The crown helped me remember that these were descriptions of my current situation, not predictions of my future destiny. I learned to think like a victor while appearing defeated. When former subordinates treated me with barely concealed contempt, I reminded myself that their behavior revealed their character, not mine. When opportunities were given to less capable individuals, I told myself that I was being prepared for opportunities they could not handle. This mental positioning required tremendous discipline because everything around me suggested that accepting defeat was more realistic than maintaining hope for victory. The crown taught me that realism is not about accepting current circumstances as permanent. It is about accurately assessing what can be changed and focusing energy on changing it. I developed what I call the discipline of victory consciousness, the practice of maintaining inner authority regardless of external validation. This meant making decisions based on my assessment of their long-term value rather than their immediate social acceptance. It meant treating myself with the respect I would receive if my eventual victory were already known. The crown also taught me that maintaining victory mindset during defeat serves others beyond yourself. People who are struggling need to see examples of resilience, not examples of surrender. By refusing to accept defeat as permanent, I became a model for others facing their own challenges. Your internal state determines your external recovery because it influences every decision you make during the rebuilding process. When you think like a defeated person, you make defeated decisions, inferior opportunities, associating with other defeated people, and focusing on managing decline rather than creating growth. When you maintain victory consciousness during defeat, you make victorious decisions, choosing opportunities based on their potential rather than their safety. Surrounding yourself with people who support your vision rather than those who accept your limitations, and focusing on building the future rather than managing the present. The crown taught me to distinguish between my current position and my permanent potential. My position was temporary and changeable, described where I stood at a particular moment in time. My potential was permanent and unchangeably represented the capabilities I could develop and the achievements I could accomplish given proper conditions and sufficient time. During my darkest period, I created what I called the morning ritual of sovereignty. Each day before dawn, I would spend 30 minutes in meditation, reminding myself of my true identity beneath the temporary circumstances. I would visualize my eventual victory in vivid detail, not as wishful thinking, but as inevitable reality. That was simply taking longer to manifest than originally planned. I would review my capabilities objectively, acknowledging areas where I needed improvement while celebrating strengths that remained intact despite my current situation. I would set intentions for the day that reflected my victorious identity rather than my defeated circumstances. This practice became the foundation of my mental resilience during the most challenging months of my recovery. The crown also taught me about the power of inner authority in influencing others. Even during my period of public disgrace, certain people continued to treat me with respect because they sensed something unbroken in my spirit. They responded to my inner conviction about my eventual recovery, even when external evidence suggested such faith was unrealistic. This inner authority became a magnetic force that attracted allies who were drawn to my unshakable belief in my future rather than deterred by my present circumstances. People wanted to be associated with someone who maintained dignity during difficulty, who showed strength during weakness, who demonstrated faith during doubt. I learned that maintaining victory consciousness during defeat requires constant vigilance against the voices of surrender that surround you. Well-meaning friends will suggest that accepting your current situation is more realistic than hoping for recovery. Enemies will remind you daily of your failures and limitations. Society will pressure you to adjust your expectations downward and settle for less than you originally sought. The crown becomes your shield against these influences, reminding you that external voices cannot determine internal reality. Your worth is not subject to popular vote. Your potential is not limited by current performance, and your future is not bound by your past. The crown represents the unassailable truth that you are more than your circumstances and greater than your temporary defeats. When you wear this invisible crown consistently, it changes how you approach every aspect of your recovery. You invest in your development as if success were certain. You treat setbacks as temporary obstacles rather than permanent barriers. You make decisions based on your long-term vision rather than your short-term feelings. Most importantly, you inspire others by showing them what unshakable inner authority looks like in practice. The torch of shared wisdom burns before me, a flame that grew brighter by lighting other torches, representing wisdom shared through vulnerability. This torch taught me that sharing my defeats created deeper connections than sharing victories ever could, and that my struggles could become others' victories through my example. I discovered this truth during my darkest period, when a young officer approached me with his own tale of humiliating defeat. He had heard about my downfall and, instead of avoiding me as most others did, sought me out because he believed I might understand his pain in ways that successful commanders could not. As I listened to his story, I recognized my own journey reflected in his struggles. He had made similar mistakes, fallen into comparable traps, and was experiencing the same shame and confusion that had tormented me. The difference was that I had traveled further along the path of recovery and could offer guidance based on lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Instead of offering empty encouragement or abstract advice, I shared the honest details of my own failures, the mistakes I had made, the blindness I had suffered, the despair I had endured. I told him about the broken sword of my youth, the nights I had questioned whether I possessed any military ability at all, and the moments when surrender seemed more appealing than continued struggle. Something remarkable happened as I spoke. The shame I had carried about my defeats began to transform into purpose. My failures, which had seemed like personal weaknesses that needed to be hidden, became valuable lessons that could spare others similar pain. My wounds, which had felt like permanent scars, revealed themselves as sources of wisdom that only experience could have provided. The young officer left our conversation with renewed hope and practical strategies for his recovery. More importantly, I left with a new understanding of my defeat's true value. They were not just obstacles I had to overcome, they were experiences that qualified me to help others overcome similar obstacles. This realization changed my entire relationship with failure. Instead of hiding my defeats or trying to forget them, I began to see them as credentials for a different kind of leadership, based on authentic struggle rather than untested theory. People who had never failed could offer advice about avoiding failure, but only those who had failed and recovered could offer guidance about the recovery process itself. I began sharing my story more openly, not from a need for sympathy, but from recognition that my experience could serve others. I spoke to groups of struggling leaders, wrote detailed accounts of my mistakes and lessons learned, and made myself available to anyone facing challenges similar to those I had overcome. The torch grew brighter with each sharing. Every person who found hope in my story of recovery became a source of light for others facing similar darkness. The wisdom gained through my defeats multiplied as it spread, helping people I would never meet overcome challenges I would never know about. I learned that vulnerability creates connection in ways that success cannot. When I shared my victories, people admired my capabilities but felt distant from my experience. When I shared my defeats, people recognized their own struggles and felt encouraged by my recovery. The leadership that emerged from authentic struggle proved more influential than leadership based on natural talent or favorable circumstances. This teaching through defeat also completed my own healing process. Each time I helped someone else navigate challenges I had faced, I reinforced my own understanding of the lessons I had learned. Each person who succeeded using wisdom gained from my failures validated that my struggles had served a purpose beyond my personal development. The responsibility that comes with transforming defeat into wisdom is sacred. Once you have traveled the path from defeat to victory, you become a guide for others making the same journey. Your story becomes proof that recovery is possible. Your strategies become tools others can use. And your example becomes inspiration for those who need to believe that their current defeat is not their final destination. The torch reminds me that the highest purpose of personal victory is enabling others' victories, and the greatest value of recovered strength is using it to help others find their own strength. Over the years, I have seen countless individuals transform their own defeats into service for others. A merchant who lost his business to political corruption became an advocate for fair trade laws that protected other entrepreneurs. A scholar who was exiled for his unpopular views used his experience to create safe spaces for intellectual discourse. A military officer who was dismissed for insubordination became a teacher who helped other soldiers learn how to challenge unjust orders without destroying their careers. Each of these individuals discovered that their defeats had prepared them for contributions they could never have made otherwise. Their wounds became credentials for a different kind of leadership. Their failures became qualifications for a unique type of service, and their recoveries became proof that others could overcome similar challenges. I established what I called the Academy of Second Chances, an informal network of mentors who had all experienced significant defeats and recovered to help others do the same. We met regularly to share strategies, discuss challenges, and coordinate our efforts to reach people who needed guidance during their darkest moments. The Academy became a place where defeat was honored rather than hidden, where failure was studied rather than ignored, and where recovery was taught through lived experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Students came to us not because we had never failed, but because we had failed spectacularly and learned how to transform failure into wisdom. Through this work, I discovered that teaching others accelerated my own continued growth. Each person I helped taught me something new about resilience, recovery, and the human spirit's capacity for transformation. My defeats, which had once seemed like purely personal tragedies, became the foundation for contributions that impacted hundreds of lives. The torch teaches that your defeats are not private property. They are resources that belong to anyone who can benefit from the lessons they contain. When you hoard the wisdom gained from your struggles, you rob others of guidance that could spare them unnecessary pain. When you share your failures openly, you create a legacy that multiplies the value of everything you endured. I learned that the story of your recovery is often more important than the fact of your success. People can admire your achievements from a distance, but they can learn from your struggles by walking the same path. Your victories might inspire temporary motivation, but your defeats provide permanent education for anyone facing similar challenges. The responsibility is profound but also joyful. When you help someone else transform their defeat into victory, you complete a cycle that began with your own recovery. The person who helps you during your darkness passes the torch to you. You carry it forward by lighting the way for others. They, in turn, will illuminate the path for those who come after them. This is how wisdom spreads through generations, how strength multiplies through sharing, and how individual defeats become collective victories that lift entire communities. The torch reminds me that no defeat is wasted if it ultimately serves to help others avoid similar failures or recover from comparable struggles. The monument of transformed defeat stands in my private garden, memorial not to victory, but to the defeats that made victory possible and meaningful. This monument represents my final understanding of defeat's true purpose and the legacy I hope to leave for those who will face their own battles in ages yet to come. As I reflect on my journey from that broken young commander to the strategist whose principles have guided leaders for millennia, I see that my defeats were not obstacles to my destiny, they were the very foundation upon which my destiny was built. Every victory I achieved carried within it the wisdom gained from previous defeats. Every strategy I developed was refined by failures that taught me what did not work. The monument bears no inscription of my triumphs, no catalogue of battles won or enemies conquered. Instead, it honors the defeats that taught me humility, the failures that revealed my limitations, and the setbacks that forced me to develop capabilities I never knew I possessed. These defeats shaped my character more profoundly than any victory ever could. I have come to understand that there are two types of victories in this world: those that come easily and those that are forged in defeat. Easy victories teach you that your current approach works under favorable conditions. They boost confidence but provide limited wisdom. They create success but not strength, achievement but not character. Victories forged in defeat are different. They teach you how to succeed despite unfavorable conditions, how to find strength when weakness seems inevitable, how to create opportunity where none appears to exist. These victories transform you into someone capable of helping others achieve victories of their own. Your defeats will be your most valuable contribution to others because they represent experiences that others can learn from without having to endure themselves. Your victories might inspire admiration, but your defeats and how you transformed them provide practical guidance for anyone facing their own challenges. The monument reminds me that every defeat contains the seeds of future victory, but only for those who have the patience to plant them and the wisdom to nurture their growth. The pain you feel during defeat is not punishment, but preparation, not judgment, but refinement for the person you are meant to become. As I near the end of my earthly campaign, I am more grateful for my defeats than for my victories. My victories belonged to specific moments and particular circumstances. My defeats became eternal lessons that continue to serve new generations of leaders facing challenges I could never have imagined. To you who are reading this while feeling defeated, know that you stand at the threshold of your greatest growth. Your current defeat is not evidence of your inadequacy, it is the universe's way of preparing you for victories that your current self could not handle. The wisdom you gain from transforming defeat into victory will become your greatest gift to a world that desperately needs examples of resilience. Your defeats are foundation stones for a monument of triumph that others will admire long after your temporary struggles are forgotten. The strength you develop through adversity will enable you to help others who face similar challenges. The wisdom you gain through failure will become more valuable than any success you might have achieved without it. I charge you to see your defeat as I have learned to see mine, not as evidence of your limitations, but as preparation for your ultimate contribution. Transform your wounds into wisdom, your failures into strength, and your setbacks into the foundation of a legacy that will inspire others long after your personal battles are won. The monument stands as proof that the eternal nature of wisdom gained through temporary defeat makes every struggle worthwhile. Your defeat today is tomorrow's victory story, waiting to encourage someone else who needs to believe that defeat is never final for those who refuse to surrender to it. Rise, not because defeat is easy to overcome, but because you were meant for victories that can only be achieved by those who have learned defeat's deepest lessons. Your greatest triumph awaits on the other side of your current struggle. The monument has taught me that defeat serves a purpose that victory alone cannot fulfill. Victory proves what you can accomplish under favorable conditions, but defeat reveals who you are under pressure. Victory demonstrates your capabilities, but defeat develops your character. Victory creates success, but defeat creates strength that enables lasting success. In my final years, I have watched countless individuals achieve what they thought was their greatest desire, only to discover that easy victory left them unprepared for the challenges that success itself would bring. They had capabilities but not character, achievement but not wisdom, success but not the strength to sustain it when circumstances changed. Those who had been forged in defeat approached success differently. They understood its temporary nature, appreciated its value more deeply, and used it more wisely because they knew how quickly it could disappear. They built foundations that could withstand future storms because they had learned to build during the storm itself. The monument reminds me that your defeats are not punishments for past mistakes. They are preparations for future responsibilities. The strength you develop through struggle qualifies you for challenges that those who have never struggled cannot handle. The wisdom you gain through failure prepares you for decisions that those who have never failed are not equipped to make. See now that every defeat contains a gift that can only be unwrapped through the process of recovery. The gift is not the defeat itself, but what you become while transforming the defeat into victory. This transformation creates capabilities, character, and wisdom that cannot be developed any other way. Your current defeat, no matter how devastating it seems, is preparing you for a victory that your current self cannot even imagine. The person you are becoming through this struggle will be capable of achievements that the person you were before the defeat could never have accomplished. The monument stands as my final testament to the power of transformed defeat. It honors not the victories that came easily, but the defeats that came necessarily, defeats that broke me down so I could be built up stronger, defeats that humbled me so I could be elevated higher, defeats that wounded me so I could be healed more completely. To you who read these words while feeling the weight of your own defeat, know that you stand in sacred space. You are in the place where transformation occurs, where character is forged, where your greatest self is being born from the ashes of your current struggle. Your defeat is not your destination. It is your departure point for a journey that will take you places you never knew existed. The monument of your eventual triumph will honor not just what you achieved, but what you overcame to achieve it. Your victory will be sweeter because of the bitterness you have tasted, stronger because of the weakness you have conquered, and more meaningful because of the meaninglessness you have endured. This is the final wisdom the monument offers. Every defeat carries within it the seed of a victory that would be impossible without it. Your job is not to avoid the defeat, but to nurture the seed until it grows into the triumph it was always meant to become.